Let's see. Hi, hi, blended students. This is Robert Cummings. We are joining you from MIT to present our track planning presentation. With me, I have two of my colleagues. Justin Snow here on the right. He supports the residential program. And on my left here, I have Aaron Gazarians. And in the audience, we have all of the residential students. So we will start with Aaron presenting. We'll begin the presentation. Let me just switch the cameras here. Okay.
That's what I'm gonna do. You don't want this review.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Oh, then they get this, but that's good.
That's
fine. Okay, everyone. Good morning. So as most of you already know, we are planning a trips this spring, and they will be during SIP week in March. SIP week is usually a week that Sloan students get off. This year, we have decided that SCM will also be getting that week off from SCM courses. So hopefully, if most of you are taking only Sloan and SCM courses, you won't have any issues with missing class. If you are taking something outside of those two schools, you will have to let your professor know that you are taking a trip that is required for your degree. In the past, we have usually gone down to Panama. With the introduction of the blended class last year, it became too difficult to accommodate over 80 students to go to one city. So we planned and went to the San Francisco Bay Area last year in May to visit alumni and companies out there in Silicon Valley. As you can see from the map, this year we are attempting and planning to introduce another trip to the Northwest, specifically Washington State, with a stop in Portland. The California trip will hopefully include a stop in Los Angeles. What I will say about these two trips, the domestic trips, the second city stops is still subject to change. We have never done this, so it's going to depend a lot on how well the planning proceeds and what kind of response we get from our partner companies and alumni in those areas. The trip to Panama will also be pretty much the same as the one from last year. I know a lot of you have seen a video that the students put together highlighting some of the stuff they did. I am going to talk to you guys primarily about the Panama trek. And here's an outline of the stuff we will be covering. I will talk about the Panama trek. Justin will talk to you guys about the California trek. Robert will talk about the Washington trek. And then obviously there's some logistic stuff that we will cover at the end regarding travel, the assignment each one of these treks encompasses, how expenses are handled, and the selection and timeline for determining who goes to which location. So with that, we'll start with Panama. The Panama trek has been one that we've been doing for a few years. I believe Bruce has been down there 6-7 years at this point. It is done in partnership with CLI. CLI is one of our scale partner centers. Unlike the other ones in Zaragoza, Luxembourg, Missy, and Ningbo, it is the only one that does not have a graduate program. So they're primarily a research center. And the educational aspect for them is they have something called the UC-Log for undergrad students in the summer, and the GC-Log program, which is here in July, and who will be joining you in January for IAP. It is just that the GC-Log program, for those of you who don't know, is a certificate program. So it's primarily people who are recently out of college or just started positions where they feel like the certificate will help advance their career. This trip, I will be serving as the lead. Ileana will be joining me as for staff, and we are hoping and planning to have Mark Colvin, who is the Scale academic manager, to join us as well. We will be leaving on Saturday, March 16th. A trip ends Friday, March 22nd. As you can see, it says 2 morning flight options. MIT has a guideline that requires no more than 20 students and or staff be on a single flight. So because of the size of the group, in the past it was 40. This year it's going to be less than 40. Still over 20, so it requires 2 different flights. We will randomly decide who goes on which one, unless there's some reason they leave basically the same time. One of them is a direct flight on Copa Airlines to Panama. The second one is an American Airlines flight that has a hour-and-a-half layover in Miami. Here is a map that outlines some of the places we will be visiting. As you can see, we will have stops both on the Atlantic and Pacific side of Panama. We have divided the trip into 2. So we start by landing in Tucumán Airport here near Panama City, and we take a bus all the way to the other side of the country, to the Colón area. And through the week, we work our way back towards Panama City. So part 1 of the trip. Upon arrival, again, we arrive on Saturday. There's not much we can do. We get you to the hotel. We have a group dinner at the hotel, and we start the trek on Sunday. Sunday's stops include Fort San Lorenzo, which is an old Spanish fort on the coastline. We go over the Gatun locks, and the guides will show us where the old original Panama Canal was built or attempted to be built by the French. And we make a stop at the Agua Clara Observation Center, where we can see the Panama Canal operating. It's like an overlook, so you get a great view of ships coming in, going up and down the locks, depending on which direction they're going. And we also have an educational video that they have there that we can watch and learn about the history of the Panama Canal. The second part of the Colón visit includes stops to the MIT port, the Colón imports. We learn about the free trade zone, a little bit more about the Colón area, and then we take a train down towards Panama City. The hotel where we're staying is outside of the city, in the City of Knowledge. It's somewhat of an industrial park with a lot of international companies and organizations set up there. While on the Panama City side, we will be making trips and visits to the Port of Balboa. We will be passing over the Bridge of the Americas, which connects the 2 continents. We will also be visiting companies such as Coches. I like to refer to them as the Panamanian Home Depot. They show us their operation and kind of show us some of the stuff they're working on. They're also a partner of CLI as of this year, so I think it was probably one of the highlights of the trip last year, and I think anyone who's going to attend this year will also enjoy it. On the Panama City side, we will also be staying very close to and seeing the Miraflores locks. And when I say close, I mean, I would wake up and look out the window and see ships going up and down the locks. So, I mean, you're very close. This part 2 of the trip also includes a visit to the Gamboa National Park. Last year, we took boat rides into the jungle to see some of the local wildlife. We went to a wildlife refuge where we saw some of the animals people have rescued, and they're trying to rehabilitate them to release them back into the wild. And yeah, there's other stops. We'll go to the Old City for an evening, Amador Causeway, which is this area down here, which you guys can see. Unfortunately, the people joining us online can't. And that is kind of, here's a little breakdown I put on here just so you guys have an idea of how the agenda is set up. What I will say is it is full of visits, and it's very scheduled to the minute. We can't have people taking their time to get on buses. We need to make sure we're there on time, and hopefully we don't have any issues that have arisen in past trips. This is a breakdown of part one. Here's a little breakdown of part two. Probably another highlight of the trip is on Tuesday. You can see this, the first thing listed is called ENADE. ENADE is I guess I would call a vocational school where local Panamanians are trained on how to work in ports. So that's anything from operating a forklift to operating the cranes to unload the ships. They have simulators that we watched students practicing on. They even allowed some of our students to practice on to learn what it takes to operate a crane, what it takes to operate a forklift in some of their ports. Again, Wednesday, the highlight there is a visit to Coches, kind of seeing their automated system in their warehouse, what they're working on, what they're planning on doing moving forward. Thursday, visiting the port. Tuesday and Wednesday, we split the group, usually split the group in half. Half go to the port, half go to the Gamboa Refuge Center, and then there's a swap on Thursdays. And Thursday afternoons is, as we get ready to end the trip, there are student presentations. We will discuss somewhat about the assignment towards the end of this presentation. So if you have any questions, hold off on that. Things to keep in mind. I know a lot of you have probably heard of Zika. It was big a couple years ago. Everyone was afraid of Zika. Didn't want to go to Florida. Didn't want to go to certain places. What I want to highlight here is it's still an issue in Panama. So if that is something you might be concerned about, it's something to take into consideration. Again, we do go to, we're going to a country that Zika is present in, and we also do go to a rainforest where as much as you try, you're still going to be surrounded by mosquitoes. Later on, I think in the slides, we'll have some more information about some medical things you can do to take into consideration for specifically this trip, if not all of them. With regards to travel, as we are going to a different country, there are certain visa requirements for certain countries. In the past, we've been able to kind of circumvent this because the students have had student visas that have had long enough periods left on it, because the trip was usually in January, where it wasn't an issue. For international students, it's something that you might want to look into before making a decision as to if you want to go to Panama. We will talk about that in a little bit more detail here in a second. OPT and STEM, I'm going to let Justin kind of talk to you guys about that. Again, the deadline, the application process starts on March 8th, which is a Friday. Ideally, you don't want to send out anything before March 8th. And even we're going to probably recommend that you don't send anything out until March 11th, which is that Monday before the treks. And if there's anything you want.
So yeah, I just prepared a few notes just on this topic. It's somewhat outside the scope of the presentation, but it is important to note. And like Aaron, I did attend this trip last year, so I was heavily involved with the planning. So I just wanted to speak to that. So for any international students who are here on a visa, there are two main important considerations that you want to keep in mind when you're making decisions, which Aaron just briefly alluded to. So the first is, given the timing of the trip this year, depending on your country of citizenship, you may have to apply for an additional tourist visa, and that is going to be the responsibility of the student. For any student-specific questions, we ask that you do email Robert, Aaron, or myself after the presentation, and we can provide you with some more information that's available to us. The second is just specific to the residential students who are applying for OPT, which Aaron mentioned. We just want you to be aware that there will be a 1-week time frame before we leave for these treks to apply, if that is when you want to apply. We are going to have a meeting about this in February, so you don't need to worry too much about getting your documentation prepared at this point in time. But Maria Brennan, the SCM ISO advisor, doesn't necessarily advise against international travel after applying for OPT, as long as we're still actively working on the SCM program. But as an extra precaution, you can apply to get an email or text receipt for your application, because this could be potentially something that customs would ask you when re-entering the country. And this kind of just goes in general for any personal international travel you may be planning for later in the spring semester, regardless of the Panama trek. So again, long story short, we encourage you to maybe consider one of the domestic trips if any of this applies to you, but we can provide you more information at a later time.
Yeah. So then again, here's, if you guys thought it was just Panama, here's a breakdown or a map from the CDC kind of outlining where Zika is still prevalent. Health insurance is always another question that comes up for students. What I'll say here is you are covered as MIT students on their MIT Study Abroad Insurance Program. There's some information here. I won't go into too much detail about it. If you're worried about the coverage or what this entails, please come see us and we can kind of walk you through what we know about it. I know some of the staff always buys supplemental insurance just in case, because unlike your coverage, ours isn't as it doesn't cover as much. Again, and here's some information that I will again share with the group once it's determined who's going to Panama, about the travel clinic here at MIT, kind of getting an appointment, making sure you have some of the vaccinations that they highly recommend you have prior to traveling to regions like Panama. And you'll have to make sure you kind of schedule that on your own. You do it in advance time, because there are certain vaccines that take some time to kick in, so you don't want to be taking it the day before and then going down to Panama and then something happens and you're like, well, I was vaccinated, why didn't it work? Some of them just take time to kind of work through your system. And with that, I am going to pass it on to Justin, who will talk to you guys a little bit about the California trek.
Thanks, Aaron. So as I just mentioned, I did go on the Panama trek last year, but I will be the staff lead for the California trek this year, which I'm very excited about. I've never been to the Bay Area myself, so it'll be a new experience for me. Also on this trip will be Dr. Josue Velasquez and Bonnie Borthwick. I put together some fancy pictures, one of which was an actual picture of the students who attended this trek last year. And again, this ran in May, and it was planned predominantly in the spring semester. So this year we'll have a little more time to plan. We will build upon the trip that we had created last year, make some positive changes. And we're, again, looking into, based on the location of a lot of the companies, starting out in Los Angeles, which I did briefly live there, so I'm more familiar with that, but it'll be nice to go back. The actual dates of this trip will be slightly off from that of the Panama trip, so it will actually depart on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, on Sunday, and then we will return a day later. Well, the official end of the SCM sponsored trip will end on Saturday, March 23rd. But again, the same rules apply. So we will be traveling at the very least out with 2 flights to get out there initially. So these are the list of potential companies that we could be visiting in some capacity, whether that's a tour, a lecture. Again, at this point in time, because the trip will not be running until the end of March, we are still in the infancy phase of some of these projected visits, but these are the actual companies that we did visit last year. So again, in theory, we will potentially go to them again, maybe not, depending on the other companies that we reach out to and arrange. I don't know if you have anything to add about, because Robert and Aaron actually attended this trip last year, so I don't know if there's anything in particular you wanted to add about one of the visits.
Yeah, so as you could tell, we are all swapping this year. So Aaron and I went on the California trip. Sorry, I can hear myself twice. Aaron and I went on the California trek last year. I think myself, I had heard of a lot of these companies. I had never heard of Flex, but Flex actually turned out to be the best visit that we had. You realize how many products and components that Flex is involved in throughout your whole life, which I felt was really interesting. So yeah, I felt like it was a very rewarding experience, and the blended students really enjoyed going as well. I think we had a great experience, and Justin will talk a little bit more about sort of like the day-to-day plans, but visiting the companies, having tours, and we capped it off with an alumni mixer at the end.
Great, thanks, Robert. So here's a map. Again, this is tentative, but we would be actually initially beginning in Los Angeles and then heading to the Bay Area. So there's a spread of the travel we'll be doing. Student involvement. So, yes. Yes.
One of the things we're going to do, so in Panama, we see the ports, and we go out, the big ships are being loaded, unloaded. In Los Angeles, there's a fellow who was getting his PhD here the same time Chris was getting his PhD here. And he works for Matson, and they have a terminal in Long Beach, right? And he's a really friendly guy to us. He loves us, we love him, right? And so he's anxious to have you come visit their terminal and get to see the port operations in LA. So that's actually probably the reason you're going to have 2 locations instead of just one, is to be able to hit that port.
All right, great. Thanks, Bruce. I'll just briefly reiterate in case that didn't get picked up for the blended students. Sounds like you did hear it. Okay, moving on. So there will be some level of student involvement as far as planning events, maybe outside of the company visits or the port visits. Last year, we did a visit to Alcatraz, and then we also had a tour of Stanford. So again, we could continue that tradition, or we could think of something else to do. So, you know, again, I think those visits were enjoyed by staff and students last year. Of course, optional excursions, there will be some limited free time for you to have social outings, et cetera, and experience the area largely at night. And then, like we did last year, and we're going to continue that tradition, we're going to organize an alumni event, because the Bay Area is arguably one of our largest hubs for alumni. So it'll be a great opportunity to reconnect with them and to engage with them moving forward. And we will be designing group t-shirts. So you'll already have an automatic souvenir. Okay, so this is just a very rough schedule, somewhat based off of last year and somewhat to align with what we're doing with the other treks. We will arrive probably in the morning on Sunday, so before we can check into the hotel, we will hopefully do some sort of sightseeing in the LA area, to be determined. And then you'll see a lot of the company visits will be in the morning. Tentatively, we're going to have the alumni mixer on Thursday evening of that week. So again, more details to come. Yes, okay. Yep. So I will hand it over to Robert now, who will be explaining the Washington trek.
Sounds great. So the Washington trek, as we've named it, is the one that is most up for determination, since we have not gone there before. So in terms of the plans, it would actually align the same dates with the San Francisco trek. So we would depart on Sunday, March 17th. Ideally 2 morning flights. Luckily, there's lots of options to fly direct to Seattle for us. And we would have our trek over the whole week and ending on Saturday. There was a few pictures here. Seattle has Seattle is probably our second largest, if not equally as large, alumni area. So we'll have a lot of companies to visit. In terms of staff who are going, I will be the lead point of contact, helping to book flights, make arrangements. Len will also be going, and then Maria Jesus will be or Dr. Maria Jesus will be our sort of CTL representation going. I have never myself actually gone to the Pacific Northwest. There's even some debate if the group likes to change the name. We can call it the Pacific Northwest Tour, the trek. I've even seen Cascadia is what's the area reference. So all up for debate before we put it on the shirt. Potential companies. Some of the biggest and most well-known companies are in the Seattle area, particularly Amazon, Microsoft. We have alumni in this area from all these companies. Boeing actually has a very interesting tour that you can tour their facilities, which I'm really hoping we could do. And then Portland, so far we only have one company possibility, Nike. So that one sort of is the most to be determined. But Portland and Seattle are actually pretty close. I believe it's only 3 hours or so. So it's always possible to just do a day trip there if we just have one company lined up. In terms of the locations, as you can see here, they're a lot closer than than Los Angeles and San Francisco. It's actually very close to Canada, as you can see in the top left. That's the border with Canada. So options to go elsewhere after the trip as well. Student involvement will be, yeah. Yes. And yes, again, Seattle has ports as well. So that would be an area to visit, sort of do like a land, sea, and air excursion if we get to visit Boeing, see a port in Seattle, and then obviously a lot of companies in the area as well. Student involvement will likely be the same as California. This trip has the possibility for the most customization. Since we haven't done it before, we can get your input, particularly for planning outings, sites to visit. I know Pike's Place Market is obviously a destination that we can go to, but there's a lot of other areas in Seattle, or even just excursions outside of the city. I know Mount Hood is a big destination, but it's right in the area as well. You get to engage with companies and build connections with alumni. We are tentatively planning to schedule our Seattle alumni mixer on Wednesday. So you'll get to see all of the alumni in the area. We want to do a group t-shirt as well for all 3 treks. And then planning post-trek activities will be a component of the trip as well. So this was all very similar to to San Francisco. In terms of the layout, we are slightly different. So we would start in Seattle first and spend a majority of the time there, 4 days at least, with company visits in the morning, and then planning tours, excursions, and other dinners. And the alumni mixer would take place in the first half of the week. And then if things go well, we would move on to Portland with the possibility of visiting companies in Portland for a day. And the trek would officially end on Saturday morning, where you'd be able to depart. So now moving on to sort of the planning phase and what you can expect over the next couple of weeks and months. So travel, as we mentioned, the trips are very closely aligned. They're just 1 day difference. In terms of departure, you will obviously have class, or you do have classes the week before. So we are planning on fixed departure dates and times that we select in conjunction with our travel agency who helps book all of our flights. As Aaron mentioned, only 20 people, up to 20 people are allowed per flight. So we have to have some flexibility, but it's always worked in the past to get everybody on those 2 flights. Now, the return flight poses an interesting new opportunity for all of you. As you know, spring break will be the following week, which gives you the ability to plan your own sort of trip post completion of the trek, but within limitations in terms of what we will help with and the flight options available. So as we mentioned here, the flights themselves will be flexible. You can choose return dates anytime within spring break. And we are putting the onus on you as the students within your groups, your trek groups, to select 2 return flights for the entire group to return. For Panama, for example, last year, there were 2 flights that actually Justin chose. So this time we're even giving you a little more flexibility in choosing the return dates. But it is limited to just those 2 flights. So everybody has to agree so that we can book round trip tickets. That's particularly important for Panama because tickets have to be booked round trip. We're also going to have the same requirements for California and Washington, just to keep it fair for everybody. Some of the limitations we mentioned here, the return flight has to be within a reasonable price. So if it's $500 to return on Sunday, but $3,000 to return on Monday, you're gonna have to return Sunday or find a comparable flight. And again, we'll work with the travel agency. They sort of do that work for us, but you can keep that in mind when you're looking at flights. Obviously, it's spring break for everybody in the US. They're sort of staggered, so that's why we're planning further in advance to get the trips booked. The flights have to be purchased as a group, no single flight options. So the only options are to fly as a group, or if you have some other plans in mind, you can book it yourself, but we would not reimburse you. So if you are in Panama, you want to fly to Mexico, have a great time, sounds great, it's on you though. The flights must depart from the trek location and must go to Boston. So again, if you are in LA and you want to fly to Las Vegas, we're not paying for a flight from Las Vegas to Boston. We can't justify it to MIT Travel to justify your spring break. So the flights do have to be direct to Boston when you're returning. And as I mentioned, personal travel or any deviation is not covered or reimbursed by MIT. So if you go to other spring break destinations, if you can work it back in that you get back to LA to get on the group flight or San Francisco, all the better. Academics and expenses. So as a reminder, this is a class that will go on your transcript. The class is the Supply Chain Study Trek. You will get 3 units of pass-fail credit. And here we just have sort of a lofty description of what we describe as the class. The main requirements are attendance and punctuality. So we are putting on a good face for all of our alumni, all of our former alumni and our partner companies. So we want to make sure you are on time, you dress properly, and that you interact with them. They're taking time to host us, so we want to make sure we are pleasant to them, just as you are when the companies come to visit us. There will be graded assignments for each trip that will be determined in the spring. So you'll have to do an assignment while you're a part of the trip. In terms of expenses, we will have a fixed per diem that will be an estimate of out-of-pocket expenses. So we do our own little formula to find out what is a reasonable amount for you to spend on your meals and travel that is not covered by MIT. So in a lot of cases, we'll be organizing bus tours and have things pretty planned out, but sometimes you may need to take an Uber or go to lunch or dinner on your own. So we will calculate that It'll be a conservative amount, so obviously, depending on your own taste, you may spend a lot more, you may spend less. You can work with others to sort of share the cost, but it will just be a fixed amount. You will not be submitting reimbursements for any exact expenses, so it'll just be sort of an umbrella for all your expenses. And the exact amount will be determined in the spring. Yeah. And I'll pass it on to Justin.
All right, thanks, Robert. So I'm going to finish up with next steps moving forward. So the selection process and the timeline. So like we've already discussed briefly, our goal is to have an even split with the treks in regards to total number and also between residential and blended. Again, this is our first time coordinating this, so stay tuned. But as far as right now, we're shortly after this going to send an initial straw poll to get a feel for interest. But the official trek bidding will open September 26th next week. We'll give you a few weeks through October, or a week and a half through October 8th. And that's when the bidding will close, and it'll take us a few days to kind of sort everything out. And then we will announce your trip. We will allow a swap period for the dust to settle, as we imagine there may be some dust. And then hopefully by October 15th, we'll have the group set. And this is something we're going to leave up to the group to self-manage. We are hoping that one representative from the residential program and one representative from the blended program for each trip can be elected or selected in some way to kind of be the leads to communicate with the staff and the rest of the group, and also, in theory, play a role in planning anything beyond the SCM-sponsored trip, and be in attendance at those, if as well. And so part of that role, and just collectively as a group, will also be determining the return flights, as Robert mentioned, and we're hoping to have those selections provided to us by October 29th so that we can book the tickets in the beginning of November. So like I said, next step, straw poll, we'll send that out. And then we'll also send out a link to the actual bidding. And yeah, I mean, we'll obviously be updating you throughout the rest of the semester and into the spring semester with planning details, et cetera. But that concludes the presentation for today.
So we have roughly 10 minutes to take some questions from both in the room and online. Start with Kenny.
So for the Pacific Northwest and California trips, like if we're going to two cities, but then we stay later, like does it matter which city we come back from? Does it need to be the one we fly into, or should it be the other one we go to?
Currently, it could be any of them. We may have to. Oh, so sorry. The question was. I'll just repeat it. For the domestic trips, do you have to return from the city that you leave? So like if we end in Portland, do you have to depart from Portland to return to Boston? We don't have that limitation in place yet, but it just determines based off of the flight and what your group decides. In our mind, you still have to choose between at least one of those two locations. Possibly, where that's still a question, depending on the flights.
I think at this point, we're gonna see what comes our way as far as ideas and planning within this framework. And then again, we have to kind of present that to MIT and the travel agency, and then go from there.
But primarily MIT.
Yeah. There was one question online, just what is the difference between the poll and the bidding? The poll is just for us to get a better idea of everybody's preference. And then
ranking, correct?
Yeah, it's just rank 1, 2, 3, to give us a general idea.
Yeah.
I understand the restrictions around the return flight to try to control costs and justify them. If we were able to find a return flight elsewhere that we could prove was cheaper,
we be able to propose that because it would actually be a cost savings to MIT?
No.
Okay. Okay.
So yeah, the question was, if you find a cheaper flight from somewhere else, can you justify that to MIT? No. The reason is because the destination, and so any destination will not be accepted other than where we are actually going, and Boston.
Brittany?
If spouses or partners want to come at the end, like into the spring break, how would that work, or can that work?
So this did happen last year, and in theory, previous years before that. Again, some people did arrive even like the last day or two of the trek, and you know, that was kind of up to the student and whoever it was that was joining them to sort out stay and travel for that person. But yes, and then they joined for the extra weekend.
Yeah, and yeah, we had students who a spouse/partner purchased tickets on the same return flight on their own, so that's perfectly fine as well. There was one question online from a blended student. Is there any general issue with leaving the US before we graduate? No, there actually is not. These are just all things to keep in mind. So the visa requirements, as long as you have your travel signature and it's an appropriate. Yeah, so the blended students will have a separate orientation in January where you'll get all the information about travel to keep in mind.
And just to elaborate a little more for the residential students who are here, we are going to have this meeting February 13th. I just said it, but again, I'll send that out at some point closer to. And we'll go over all this type of stuff. But yes, your I-20, the second page, will have to be signed for any international travel. And again, as long as you're traveling prior to the end of our SCM program, so not graduation, but actually the official end of the MIT semester, you are in theory okay to travel outside of the United States. But again, there are several precautionary steps you can take as far as documentation that you have with you. But that's all we can really advise, I guess, on that topic.
Yep. Any other? Yep.
Do you have to have roommates at the hotels, or be on your own?
So one question, do we have to have roommates on? Yes.
That will be as soon. I mean, once we get the groups selected, we will obviously send out a survey, collect all the information we need for Panama, specifically on the passport information, and on that we ask you who you would want to share a room with.
So you can manage that yourself, and obviously
it is 2 people per room. It's not like a bad dorm. We're not putting 4 people in the economy double or something.
And actually talk to each other about it. When I did this for San Francisco, one person had 4 roommates and he just said yes to everybody. So actually decide who you want to be your roommate. Any other questions? Yep. So I will stop the live broadcast here. And as always, you can email Justin and I or Aaron for any questions. Thank you to those of you who joined us live through the YouTube Live. And as a reminder, in 10 minutes, we will start our next webinar with Josue and Maria through the other link that I provided. Thanks again.